Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully you enjoyed that breakout. We are going to get started with our next segment in just a minute. So please stay tuned, and at 2:25, we'll be getting started right at that moment. Fantastic. Well, it is 2:25, and I am thrilled to kick this panel off. So yesterday, during our strategy session, we reflected a little bit on the critical role of state legislatures in the fight for our democracy. We talked about the fact that these are such historically overlooked venues of power, at least on our side. This is really where gerrymandering comes from, right? From state legislatures. And this level of government has such a critical, key role in fair elections, fair districting, voting rights, so many of the, frankly, key ingredients of our democracy. And as we talked about as well, with broader trends in law, in jurisprudence, in policy, toward the narrowing of federal protections and expanding the power of states, this level of government is really increasingly important, both in the immediate term and over the next period of time, right? The GOP has really shown us its playbook for 2024, at least in part, and really indicating its desire to use its legislative majorities, some unearned, right, to pass laws that continue to expand the legislature's power over election administration, certification, in other words, manipulate and subvert future elections to engineer outcomes in which they win. So, it's really a perfect time to come together and think through some of these issues with some of the greatest minds in this space. So really thrilled to have Dave Daley, who's a senior fellow at Fair Vote. He is the author of Rat Fucked, Unrigged, frequent co-author with me on issues around gerrymandering and state legislatures. We have Charlotte Hill, who is a researcher and lecturer at my alma mater, my double alma mater, UC Berkeley, go Bears. And we have Arizona State Senator Martin Quizada, who is has just been a steadfast champion for voting rights and fair elections in Arizona. So quick overview of this session. Really quick bios I'm going to sketch out for our panelists. Then we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the current state of play in terms of election subversion in our states, as well as kind of a look back at how we got here, the conditions that set this stage for us, and what we can do about it as we start to move forward. So let's dive in. As I mentioned, Dave Daley, national best-selling author. Rat Fucked is usually, gosh, it's usually, here it is, it's hiding. Dog-eared copy here. Really instrumental, that book was really instrumental in inspiring this national drive to reform redistricting. It was also the basis of the documentary Slay the Dragon. I know many of our volunteers have organized events around watching that film. He's a journalist. He's the former editor-in-chief at Salon, and as I mentioned, senior fellow at Fair Vote. Charlotte Hill, as I mentioned, researcher and lecturer at the Goldman School of Public Policy, and her research really explores how structural reforms could improve American democracy, especially for folks who have historically been shut out of the process. She is a former board member at Fair Vote, Represent Us, and the San Francisco Elections Commission, and her research has been featured in the New York Times, CNN, and elsewhere. Finally, last but not least, Senator Martin Quizada. He has been serving in the Arizona State Legislature since 2015, and he's an attorney. Earned his law degree at Arizona State University, where he is now also an adjunct law professor. And he clerked for Judge Patricia Orozco on the Arizona Court of Appeals and continues to maintain his legal practice as well. So thank you for joining us today. I think this is such a timely conversation around these issues. And so just to hop into the current state of play, at a broad level, we know that there is election subversion design afoot. There is some planning, and we have seen some opening volleys, particularly in Arizona. We'll talk about that. What is the substance of these GOP plans around election subversion and the current state of play? Charlotte, perhaps you could kick us off on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me. Really important conversation. And I think I'm guessing everyone here, I'm really concerned. I'd say, the good folks at the Brennan Center break this down into kind of four main ways that the GOP is subverting democracy right now. I generally like their breakdown. So one is legislation that gives state officials the power to change or reject election results. These kind of make the headlines, these bills. Another related one, legislation to give partisan state officials, again, it's only Republicans who are pushing these laws right now, the power to seize control of the election administration and vote counting processes. The third bucket, I think, is incredibly important and doesn't get enough attention, which is legislation to restrict, control, or punish the conduct of local election officials. So it's a lot of intimidation, effort. What we see, as a little aside here, is election officials who are just so concerned about possibly getting in trouble, because some of these laws are also kind of vaguely worded. It's not clear what's permissible under the new laws and what isn't, that they just avoid doing election outreach altogether. And we know from research that outreach from election officials is often the most trusted type of outreach in the lead up to an election cycle. So there's a real potential impact there to decrease turnout as a result. And then the fourth bucket is just the laws that make it harder to vote. And we've seen so many, hundreds of those promoted in the last year, and many of them passed. I would argue, and I'm sure Dave would agree, that there's really a fifth bucket here, which is extreme gerrymandering that can distort outcomes for, not just the next decade, but longer, right? Because you build in, you entrench power for the folks that benefit from those laws. So we could talk about where these things are getting passed and where they're getting introduced. I think that it is really problematic to look only at where laws have passed this last year and say that's the complete story. I think that the introduction of laws can have a real impact on shaping the climate of elections in a state, and shaping, we talk about that Overton window, shaping what people view as reasonable, normal, what's possible in future election or legislative cycles. So a lot to talk about there, but really, it's a concerning landscape right now. So I'll hand it over to Dave if he wants to add anything.
I think Charlotte has really just captured the landscape perfectly. I mean, I think what we are looking at potentially is a scenario in which what we saw between November 8th and January 6th of the last election is a dress rehearsal for what we would be seeing next time. And that what I would say is that those who would subvert this election are in many ways in a stronger position now than they were between November 8th and January 6th, 2020 and 2021. And that those of us who want to head this off are really running out of time and need to talk about this with the urgency that the situation requires, that those who would subvert our elections and turn losers into winners have convinced the folks on their side of the truth of this narrative, of the necessity of these laws. The polling numbers on this are a little frightening when you look at those who believe that there was fraud, or who buy into the big lie of the 2020 story. State legislatures are really at the heart of this. I mean, I would go back even a little bit further, and I would say that in some ways it's the gerrymandering of these state legislatures that began the process of putting the extremists in charge, who then have the ability to pass these laws regardless of what people in their states want to see. And that as they continue to rewrite election procedures and put themselves in charge and to politicize these operations that are not supposed to be politicized, we are in a dangerous spot and have to really recognize the gravity of the threats.
Yeah, and Charlotte, it's such an excellent way to frame the challenges and sort of the state of play in these different categories. And so it seems like, there are certainly the laws themselves that are being introduced. It's also, as you said, the chilling effects that some of these laws might have on election officials and all the rest, as well as a purpose in themselves to shape public opinion, right? To normalize concepts that might have seemed shocking and might still seem shocking now, but will they seem shocking the next time or the next time? And, I think that that sort of strategic legislation is something that we're seeing a lot in this space, and Arizona is ground zero for it, right? And so, I think that something that sort of captures that perfectly is HB 2596, which, was shot down handily. We'll let the senator discuss it, but it was not the first law in this vein to be introduced in Arizona, right? Shauna Bollock introduced a bill in 2021, and all the rest, really planning this plan to enlarge the state legislature's role in administration and certification and all the rest. And so you just, the goal for them, I think, is to keep pushing and pushing until it feels totally normal. And so, as I said, Arizona, really ground zero. Would love your perspective, Senator, about those bills and sort of more generally how the legislature in Arizona is that ground zero and what you all are seeing.
Sure. Thank you, Gabby. First of all, thank you for having me here with you. It's really an honor to be here with Mr. Daley and Ms. Hill as well. Thank you for your work. But yeah, you said it. I mean, I think legislatures are ground zero for this, and Arizona in particular has been a ground zero legislature out of all the legislatures to really test a lot of these ideas, throw them out there and just see what sticks, and then start to build a narrative around those ideas so that they can build more support for them later. One of them, like you said, and this is because elections are administered locally, and so that puts all of that decision making into at the state legislative level. So state legislatures really are a tool and a necessary tool for any kind of election subversion strategy. So here in Arizona, we've seen proposals that are really surgically designed to put barriers in front of certain voters to lessen their chances of actually participating in our elections for years. Obviously, that's one of those buckets, but we've seen all three of those buckets proposals being implemented or being proposed and implemented here in Arizona. And one of those was, like you mentioned, Gabby, House Bill 2596. And that would have basically required the Arizona State Legislature to convene a session to review the ballot tabulating process and reject the results if they so chose to reject them. That is a radical departure from the way elections are administered, and that was introduced last year, didn't get very far, reintroduced again this year, and it hasn't been given a hearing, but they used really a technical way to kill this bill by assigning it to multiple committees, basically every committee, so that the timing, it would never get through just because of the timing. But what we're seeing is that the resistance to ideas like this is getting less and less every year. And so what I expect is that they're going to start building the narrative for this issue. They're already building the narrative in a lot of the other bills that are having movement in the legislature. they're building that narrative for this type of bill, for 2596, so that they can push for this in the future. And that narrative is being built, and it's getting stronger every day. And that's the real fear that I have in my experience in the legislature.
If I could jump in really quickly, and thank you so much, Senator. I think it's something that I hear certain political pundits on the national stage say is, well, and certain academics as well, these are just messaging bills. They're just meant to appease the more extremist elements of the GOP. Hence, we see them not being given hearings sometimes. You know, they're introduced, and they fall away. And I think that it could be true that certain lawmakers are doing this to, you know, then they can run their next campaign saying, hey, I introduced this thing, and the people, the moderates in my party wouldn't let me, push it through. But this fails to give enough credit to the people, then the base of this party, who will then be energized by these policies, feel confirmed in their belief in the big lie, and other disinformation that's been pushed at them, and who then do things like storm the Capitol, right? Or threaten the lives of election officials, or then build greater support for authoritarian candidates who are running down the line. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think it's a real mistake to say that because one of these bills doesn't pass this cycle, or it may never pass, that it doesn't have a real effect on who can win and on what the agenda becomes of the Republican Party as it moves forward.
And if I could spin it forward into what's happening right now in 2022, and the elections that are coming up, those elements within the Republican Party that stood up to try to stop some of this, and I'm not going to pretend that all of them are profiles in courage, but some of them simply did their jobs, and they have been either pushed out of office, threatened out of office. They're facing primary challenges right now. To say that these are only messaging bills and that there's no danger from them, I think underestimates the authoritarian push within the Republican Party and how much deeper and further it goes with every election cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you all say, perhaps these bills, certainly these sorts of bills haven't passed yet. Perhaps they never will, but perhaps they will pass, right? Or some form of a bill. And as we know, it won't take many states to pass such a bill to really change the absolute outcome of a national election, right? You really only need two, maybe two, just two of the right states, right? So, it is possible to get there. And, it's kind of a shocking idea. I think when people hear this idea that a state legislature could just pass a law like the one in Arizona that gives them the carte blanche authority to throw out election results with which the majority party disagrees, that strikes the public's, it sort of shocks the conscience, right? We have this innate sense that's not right. That is beyond the power of a legislature to do. Dare I say, that sounds unconstitutional. However, there have been some plans put in place on the conservative side to address that sort of potential rebuttal, right? That these sorts of laws just aren't constitutional. And that's sort of also been set up behind the scenes, which is a part of what's, sort of going on right now. And, Dave, you and I have written a little bit about the independent state legislature doctrine and what this is and how this could come into play. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that and what, if a law like the one in Arizona was challenged as unconstitutional and it went up to the Supreme Court, what could happen then?
I think we would all like to believe that the US Supreme Court is going to be a defender of American democracy. But I mean, if you look at the long history of the US Supreme Court, let alone the last 10 years of the John Roberts Court, that's asking it to play a role that it historically has not played. The independent state legislature doctrine effectively is an argument that state legislatures have exclusive control over election laws in their states. And when you take that to its extreme conclusion, which is actually the only logical place to take something that is that extreme to start with, it would effectively give state legislatures the option to toss results out that they don't like. You think that I'm hyperbolic, perhaps, but there are 4 justices who have already indicated their willingness to believe in this doctrine: Alito and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Thomas. We don't know where Barrett stands. We don't know what John Roberts would do, but Barrett would be 5, and that would be enough. And I would caution everybody that the suit that Friday afternoon that North Carolina legislators, where the state Supreme Court undid an extreme partisan gerrymander, and you have lawmakers in North Carolina now appealing that to the US Supreme Court, asking them to intervene effectively under this independent state legislative doctrine. We may have a sense really quickly as to whether there is a 5th vote for this. And there was not that support after Pennsylvania undid its extreme partisan gerrymander back in 2018. The Pennsylvania Republicans attempted to get it there, but it failed. It's a different court.
Senator, any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, no, and I think this kind of ties back into what we were talking about before, that this is not by any stretch of the imagination a short-term strategy. This always has been a very long-term strategy. And I'll point back to, as an example, to the state of Arizona, where I've been watching over the last decade the strategy get implemented. And when you look at any one policy proposal, any one bill, any one action that they take, you can argue that it's not part of a bigger strategy. But when you take a step back, look at all of it put together, you see that it is very clearly a strategy. And the efforts to bias our courts, both at the federal and at the state level, has been a strategy. And we've seen that here in Arizona over the last decade. We expanded our Supreme Court. The conservative side of the aisle expanded Arizona's Supreme Court to give our current governor 4 of those appointees to that Supreme Court. We've seen the stacking of what we have in Arizona called the Commission on Appellate Court Appointments. This is a board that vets and recommends nominees to be on our appellate courts and our Supreme Court to the governor to appoint. And a secondary benefit of that strategy was that same commission also vets and recommends the members of the Independent Redistricting Commission that draws our lines. So we have been biasing our courts, biasing the commission that vets those applicants, and biasing the Independent Redistricting Commission at the same time. So this has been a very strategic long-term strategy. And I sounded the alarms about this in Arizona a decade ago. And I said, we got to keep an eye on this, because if I'm correct, which I'm hoping I'm not, if I'm correct, it's going to be the same pattern that happens for every nominee to those commissions. And it absolutely played out that way. And so, yeah, this is absolutely a long-term strategy, and the courts are going to play a big role in that. And so now we're at the point where we've got those judges in place now. It's time to see how they rule on those issues.
Long-term strategy indeed. There was a little bit of a dust up on academic Twitter, the dusty little corner of academic Twitter that some of us frequent, about this Harvard Law Review piece that I put into the chat last week or the week before, which really lays additional sort of intellectual groundwork for this idea that state legislatures have this sort of much broader authority under the Constitution around elections than sort of we expect, or is sort of lined up with our modern expectations. So there really is, as you said, this long-term strategy to seed these ideas through legitimate channels, right? Through the Federalist Society, through all the way up to our Supreme Court and all the rest. And so I think it's a really great segue to talk about what got us here. How did we get here? What are some of the factors that have led to this moment? Charlotte would be so interested in your perspective.
Yeah, we could spend a long time talking, trying to answer this question. And so I'll touch on a piece of it, and I'm curious to hear how my co-panelists think about this. A really important piece is that our two political parties realigned half a century ago around race and around business. The GOP really became the pro-business party, pro-big business, elite top 1% of 1% folks. And by definition, the top 1% of 1% can't get you elected. Their votes alone won't get you elected, right? Their money can go a long ways in helping get you some votes. But so the GOP had to build a coalition, and its base decided would be primarily white people with white supremacist values. And it really created a party incentive to not only restrict opponents' access to the ballot, but identify opponents as people of color, and really anyone who did not support more traditional values. So that often became young people as well, right? And so I do not pretend that voter suppression or election subversion is new to this country. We have, our entire country's history has plenty of examples of this happening. But I think what we see right now is this, is it being really overt and mapped so strongly onto racial and social identities in a way that I think, as you said, Gabby, can feel like an affront to the conscience, right? And I think that really does tie back to the parties realigning around these identities. So we have simultaneously, because of these social identities mapping onto people's political identities, suddenly, your race and your, to some extent, your gender, but your religious beliefs, your kind of cultural attitudes, all of these things map onto our political identities in a way that they just have not done to as great of an extent in the past, where if you tell me just whether you go to church every week, I mean, I can guess with a pretty good high degree of confidence whether you go to church, what state you live in, and what your gender is, right, or what your race is. Like I probably know which party you belong to. As we have these identities mapping onto each other, that contributes to what political scientists call affective polarization. It's not the polarization of policy attitudes, it's the polarization that makes you hate the person who doesn't belong to your political party. Because we're all pretty siloed, right? The people who are like me in all the non-political respects are also like me in political respects. I don't have many connections at this point in my life to people on the right. And I would venture that's often the case for people here. And if you do, they're probably like family members, right? But there might not be much else tying you to them. So as we have that affective polarization, it makes us trust our leaders more, the leaders of our party, and dislike the leaders of the other party more. And I think that's really important as we think about the newfound salience of democracy policy and how rapidly it seems like voters on the right have been willing to abandon a lot of pro-democracy norms and support Republican leaders as they've been pushing for bills that I would venture to say a decade or 2 decades ago would have sparked more ire among at least some folks on the right. And so it's a pretty dangerous confluence of events. We have these parties that are so sorted along identity dimensions. And then one of those parties has decided that it is going to really overtly become an anti-democracy party, and its voters, because they're so married to the party, have been willing to go along with it. The last thing I'll say here is all of this is built upon a really skewed political system. I do not think we have told an accurate story in this country about why it is that we vote the way that we do. And so we've had a normalization, a acculturation over the course of our lives to a political system that is already incredibly biased. I think that matters for a lot of reasons, but one thing I've been thinking about lately is that, I was editing some students' papers the other day, and some of them have a few errors, and some of them are just like, I'm shaking my head like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to begin. And the papers that are just full of things that need correcting, it's almost hard to notice all of the things that need correcting. It's just all a little bit overwhelming. And I suspect that a lot of Americans are in this situation when it comes to our political system. Like if we had a few things that needed tweaking, or if everything was working really well and was really fair, and then the GOP was coming in and trying to pass all of these laws, we'd be like up in arms. How dare you? But there are so many biases baked in already. So many things, single member districts, plurality voting, electoral college bias, Senate bias, you add gerrymandering that is facilitated by those single member districts and plurality. So many things that are already problematic. I think it can be really hard to now in this moment even acknowledge as an ordinary person all the things that are wrong. I'll pass it off to one of my co-panelists because there are many different ways to take a bite at this apple of how we got there.
Yeah, Dave, do you want to hop in?
It's not fair to make me follow the brilliance of Charlotte Hill. I plus one on all of that. I would, if I were to jump in and amplify from somewhere, I would say that the election of Barack Obama in 2008 really helped accelerate and turbocharge the trends that Charlotte has illuminated, that it launched, I think, a couple of different threads within the Republican Party, because what they saw was not only the election of the nation's first Black president, but they saw census and demographic changes about a changing nation, and the possibility of being a non-white nation in the near future. And they saw an electoral coalition that was coming together along these lines, that a lot of people, Democrats and Republicans in 2008, thought might be the dominant political coalition for a generation. And I mean, of course, it didn't exactly turn out that way, right? And I think a lot of that is how Republicans responded. And there were, I would say, two key threads. One of them is the sort of deep white backlash that you would see, manifested perhaps in the South Carolina congressman who stood up at the State of the Union and felt like he could just shout out, "You lie," at the nation's president, and just like the kind of white anger that turns into the Tea Party movement. And then you had an establishment piece of the Republican Party that responds to this by thinking about it electorally. And they say, well, we're in trouble at the ballot box. 2010 is a census year. It's a midterm election after a presidential election. It tends to go our way. A lot of these states are super close. If we invest some money in state legislative races in 2010, redistricting follows that up. Perhaps our short-term strategy can be using redistricting to try to buy us some time, right? And these are the people who then go to work on the autopsy after the 2012 election and say, well, if we simply start, talking to young people, if we start talking about issues that communities of color care about more, we can fix and reform our party. But all of this kind of comes together. These threads meld. And after 2012, it was not possible to be a party of the Republican autopsy. You couldn't do immigration reform, right? They had drawn themselves a nation that was a fantasy nation, in which all of the demographic trends in America that were actually driving our politics stopped and reversed themselves in these Republican states and these Republican districts. And they elected a different breed, and then they incentivized everyone to behave in deference to this extreme base of a Frankenstein monster that they created.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you know, what you're both alluding to, there have certainly been some cultural shifts and sort of these sociological factors that have gone into the moment, and also really structural, right? To be an institutionalist for a second, and I think, you know, Dave, you make this point in Ratfucked that gerrymandering is not just a product of the big sort, right? There has been structural artificial manipulation, and we see it in voting rights, voting suppression legislation, as well as gerrymandering, all the rest. This is not just a natural state, right? We are not just inching towards this situation naturally or organically. There have been, as you know, as the senator said, long-term strategic machinations happening behind many scenes to produce this moment. So, you know, it's fascinating to think about, you know, we are at this moment, what is the road ahead? And, you know, I know that you all are working on this in your own ways, right? You are building the future that we're also excited about and grateful to you for doing. Really curious for, you know, for each of your thoughts about the road ahead, whether that's in the short term or in the longer term, to really shore up our institutions of elections and democracy, and what all of us can do. So, you know, perhaps Senator, you might kick things off there, and then Dave and Charlotte, if you wouldn't mind chiming in as well.
Yeah, no, a great question. And I think that because of the complexity of the nature of this problem, because it was not something that happened overnight, but it's been, you know, decades in the making, it's not going to be fixed overnight either, you know. And so I think that's where I think the rub comes in, because you know, as elected officials, we're always looking at our next election. But some of these things that we may have to do, we're going to have to put our personal you know, political futures aside and do what's best for the next generation of voters, and that's a tough thing to ask of elected officials. But I think it's going to be necessary, and some moves are going to be hard. You know, we're having a big debate right now over the filibuster in the Senate, and you know things like that, things that are that may be necessary to enact some of these fixes to the problem, but may cost you in the short term. But may benefit us in the long term. You know, aside from that, just kind of deconstructing what's happening with redistricting commissions, deconstructing the way our these elections laws are now being recreated in Arizona. You know, those are going to be long-term fixes that are going to make people upset in the short term, because it's going to be looking like we're doing the exact opposite of what they did, and we're taking, you know, countermeasures in that sense. But I think some of that is necessary. I think, you know, the second thing, and then I'll pass it along. But you know, like you said, or like was mentioned, you know, the demographics are different now, and we need to put candidates forward that can identify with those demographics. And I know in Arizona, you know, that's been a struggle. You know, I'm a member of a party, but I can't say my party has done a really good job of putting forward candidates and supporting candidates that can identify with those demographics that we need to come out and vote and be compassionate about our voting. And we haven't done as good a job about that. And so we need to be better at that. And I think that you know, that's a long-term process as well, because we will need to kind of recreate our own parties as well.
No, agreed. I think we have short-term problems and long-term problems. And in some ways, we have to think about the short-term problems because they're really urgent. Because if there are some losses in November of 2022, it's going to be all the easier for some of these things we're worried about to happen in 2024. So there are state Supreme Court races, and I know that all of you at Sister District who have been so early to understand the importance of organizing state legislative races and organizing down ballot know the importance of all of these down ballot races for secretaries of state in Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona, in Georgia, governor's races in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, state Supreme Court races in Ohio and North Carolina. All of these things just really, really crucial in 2022. But then I think we have to be having the serious long-term conversations about structural fixes, and Charlotte rattled them off. Single member districts, plurality voting, the nature of a US Senate that by 2035, 2040 is going to give 70% of the seats to 30% of the people. We have got a real minority rule problem that is only going to intensify. So we can fix in some, even if the worst doesn't happen in 2024, even if we head off some of the things that scholars and journalists and folks are afraid of, we still have all of these problems and baked in structural issues that are pushing us towards a long-term minority rule. And we have to do something to think about and fix those problems as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's a tricky time, right? I imagine a lot of people on this call are in a similar place to where I am emotionally, which is not giving up, because that's not a good, that doesn't feel good. I care about this country. I live here. My family lives here. I want it to get better. And also feeling like the opportunities for short-term change are closing left and right. And so feeling, I've been doing a lot of soul searching, and I imagine most of the folks on this call have as well. Soul searching and just theory of change searching, right? Trying to figure out what are the remaining opportunities and how can I be useful. And so I agree. I think 2022, two main priorities, or let's say 3 priorities. Keep control of the House of Representatives. That's a real uphill climb, but it's very, very important to preserving the opportunity for an additional swing at federal reform, and making it harder for the GOP to regain full control at the federal level. Retaining and increasing control in state houses, because as we've talked about, state legislatures control so much important policy, but at the state level, but also play a critical role in shaping what happens federally. And 3, relatedly, making sure that we're fending off a real concerted right-wing effort to replace local election officials with right-wing partisans, and hopefully strengthening the hold of professional, nonpartisan local election officials over our election administration. Sister District and a number of other organizations are doing important work on that front. In the longer term, I don't like framing it as a longer term. I like what Dave said about needing to have parallel tracks here. I think we need to be reshaping the understanding of federal policymakers about which changes are needed, so that if we have another swing at reform in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I don't know when it happens, but let's assume for the sake of hope in democracy that we have another chance at reform, that we, yes, are passing the things that were in HR1 and S1, but that we're not stopping there, because it's necessary but not sufficient. A lot of these reforms were introduced in like the 70s with the Watergate babies, and like it's great, but man, we can do better than 1970s politics. Like we could really do better. So I personally think that proportional representation is probably the most important, if we had to choose one, the most important reform, but it's certainly not the only one.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of you have, just listening to your thoughts on the road ahead, I take a few things from this, and for everyone who's with us. And first, I just want to key on what the senator said about having elected officials who are willing to take positions that are strong and maybe politically detrimental in the short term. And I've seen so many, comments in the chat about how inspiring the president in Ukraine has been over the past several days, and really leading by that example of, really being willing to have leaders that are willing to say the things that need to be said. And part of that, as you said, Senator, is making sure that we're committing to candidates who are building towards a reflective democracy, right? We need the right people to be able to say the right things, right? We need to be able to share the perspectives of, and that's something we all can be doing, right? That's a concrete thing we can be taking out of this, is that we need to be building towards that reflective democracy so that we have leaders who are in a position to speak to the issues that matter and to say the things that need to be said. The second, I think, is really important that you keyed on in different ways. The senator said it, Charlotte said it, Dave said it in different ways, which is that we need to examine and challenge our understanding of things, right? And one example is commissions. Turns out they're not all great, right? We collectively put a lot of time and energy and political capital into this idea of commissions, and devil's in the details, right? Maybe we need to be, we need to continue to challenge our understanding of what the best reforms are, right? The structural fixes, as Charlotte said, we need to reconsider what's needed in this moment, and not just be committed to the reforms of the past, or that we're indoctrinated to want. Single member districts, plurality voting, those sorts of things. We need to learn about them. We need to talk about them. We need to understand them so that we can advocate for the right reforms. And then the last thing that I'll close with, which is really our mission here, and I think you all said it in different ways, we can invest in down ballot races, right? There are incredible nested opportunities this year. Many of you keyed on the governor's races, secretaries of state races this year, competitive Senate and congressional races. When yesterday in our strategy session, we discussed the fact that all of the states that we've selected this year provide those nested opportunities, with open and flip opportunities at the gubernatorial, critical Secretary of State hold and flip opportunities, critical, at the Senate as well. And so our work down ballot, raising visibility and dollars and turnout at the bottom of the ticket, can help us combat the terrible ballot roll-off we see on our side and really build momentum all the way up. So I want to thank you all for joining us and really leaving us with those critical pieces that we can bring forward and help us focus on what we can do in a moment that, as Charlotte said, can feel overwhelming with so many pieces at play. So thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I'll turn things over to Lala.